Hey, everybody. You're about to hear a brief retelling of the movie Animal Factory. Enjoy watching. Police found a $200,000 shipment of pot in 21-year-old Ron Decker's possession. It's not at all like a hobby and personal consumption, as the lawyer tried to convince the judge. So the guys were sent to jail for 5 years. His busy father didn't even show up in court. Life in prison goes on as usual. The authority Earl Copen and his buddies are thinking about how to nail one Italian who sells substances in the neighboring block. He needs to be dragged out into the yard, and Earl can get some help from one of the guards. Earl is distracted by another convict, Jesse, and introduces him to newcomer Ron. Not a rooster, a pure white brother. He's only been here 2 weeks and would like to get a ticket to the concert. Authority flows in the law, and Ron asked him to take a look at his case sometime. Earl went to the guard, Big Rand, and told him about a prisoner who needed to be taken out into the yard for 15 minutes. You know, like cleaning up the grounds. Usually only black guys get that job, but the fat man was willing to make an exception. As long as they don't get him wet. Earl got a ticket for the new guy. The cons agree on how they're gonna work their victim. When the guard turned his back, Ron talked to the dealer, and then he was pinned against the wall. After kicking him, they took the goods from him and went away as if nothing had happened. Ron is in a cell with a transvestite named Jean. A cellmate tells him that the bald authority figure is an old friend of his, and that in his youth he was one of the most embittered and unruly people he had ever met. One big dude once stole Earl's ass, and the bald man didn't like it, so he threw a bucket of water off the roof at the convict, but it hit him on the leg. He couldn't walk for 6 months, but Earl didn't kill him. He pities the weak. It's interesting that Earl types reports and explanatory notes himself, instead of the guards, even in cases he's involved in, like yesterday in the yard. It's time for the evening show, some guy on stage raping the ears of the other cons, but Earl and his buddy Vito are having a good time. They're already loaded up on substances and floating. Psycho Mike comes up to Ron and starts telling him that some guy claims that the new guys are snitches, so he has to deal with him. Psycho Mike had booked him an arrow for tomorrow in the West Block, so Ron had to be there. Earl doesn't like this move. Jean advises Ron to get a gun if he wants to protect his little white ass. So the kid went to Earl again the next day and asked him for a knife. He told him about the shooter, but Earl shared how things would actually play out. He would simply be lured to the West Wing, and there he would be dragged into a cell and raped. The authority figure promised he'd handle it. He took the Psycho Mike aside and hinted that instead of the guy, his guys might look into the West Wing, so they'd better keep the situation quiet. As the cons sang their homemade brew, 2 guards came in. Someone snitched on them. Zemily and Ron were on the lookout. Tank handed him a white fraternity magazine so he wouldn't get bored in solitary. Inside the magazine was a note from Earl with advice on how to deal with the prison authorities. Tip, in turn, offered Ron protection because a young, good-looking guy might not have it so good during his time in prison, and Ron shouldn't make the mistake of thinking he'd found a friend or a patron, but he'd have to pull his pants down afterward. Ron was acquitted and let go, but the evil eye was taken away, and he'll probably get another year. It turned out that Earl had retyped Ron's report before it got into the hands of his superiors and just threw out the part that said he was on the lookout. After talking to his superiors, Ron stressed why authority was always helping him. Earl says the guy was lucky to be friends with him. He had no patrons and had to survive by force alone. Psycho Mike continues to look at Ron unkindly, and in the prison yard there are sometimes incidents of varying degrees of bloodiness. 2 types were discussing something, after which one of them stabbed the other in the back and pretended not to be involved. The authority figure helped the guy go to the infirmary for a month. All it took was a dumbbell in one hand to fake an injury, so Ron didn't even have to break or cut anything. Earl knows how it's done. He's been here for 18 years, and it's best not to say prisoner. The real guys prefer the term convict. In the infirmary, Lieutenant Simon approached Ron and told him that the authority wanted to move him to his cell. The young man tensed again. Who knows what awaited him there? But for now he went back to Jan. The dark-skinned prisoners are on strike and are calling for the others to join. Jesse would like to be among them, but his white buddies will cut him off if he goes into a crowd of blacks. One convict wanted to go into the shop just to stamp his card, but he got a good beating for it anyway. A scuffle broke out and the crowd was dispersed by armed guards, but the riot was not over. The prisoners enjoyed the confusion and settling scores with their enemies. The crowd raged until the snipers on the towers had their say. 5 bodies were left lying on the lawn, the rest obeyed and lined up against the wall, and then quietly dispersed to their cells. Jen dreams of being a girl in her next life and living in Paris. His wonderful story was interrupted by a guard who took Ron to the lieutenant, but the lieutenant turned out to be Earl, who was waiting for his protege in the kitchen with a big steak. The authority is going to get him a normal job, like a barber. That's one of the conditions of a comfortable sentence, and the second condition is where you sit. Earl hears that Ron doesn't want to move into his cell for some reason. The guy's paranoid, he's worried about his ass. But the authority figure convinces him that if he wanted to, he would have done it a long time ago. Once he's down, he'll carry that label 20 years from now, and Earl doesn't want that. He needs someone who doesn't stink of jail like all his buddies, someone who can still feel. During the move, the guy noticed the Iron Man and his new girlfriend. Soon he'll be nothing but shoelaces, the inmates joked. Ron has a new life. He learns to cut hair and does not step away from the authority. They are constantly playing with a ball and communicating on a variety of topics. Earl gives the young man advice on how to reduce the sentence, and he also learned that recently there was a law according to which the judge can review the renegotiation with certain articles within 120 days. So Ron should contact a lawyer. At the lesson, the guy caught the interested look of a certain Buck Rowan. In the authority figure's cell, they constantly tease Ron and joke about his virgin ass. Earl has forged a psychiatrist report that should go to the judge in Ron's case, saying he's a calm and trustworthy citizen. That should get him released. The guy says he'll be indebted to the authority figure, but he's sure Ron will forget about him as soon as he gets out. It's happened more than once. Before the lesson, Ron looked into the toilet and there he was pinned to the wall by Buck. The big guy grabbed the guy and was about to do something irreparable, but suddenly the teacher came in and Ron managed to escape. That night he was allowed into the stash where the convicts keep their shivs, and he chose one for himself. When Earl heard this, he hurried to stop his friend, because he might be out soon and he shouldn't be in a state of fever, especially since such a case should be prepared and approached with a cool head. Earl promised to help him, but the boy wouldn't listen and went to Buck with the knife. The bald man rushed to his aid and immediately attacked the big guy. As they struggled, Ron stabbed him in the back. The bearded man demanded that he finish the job and cut his throat or Buck would snitch, but Ron didn't have time to do that and threw the knife away and left the room. The culprits were quickly found out, and both cellmates were stripped and thrown into solitary confinement. With another convict, Earl communicates through the toilet. The authority asked to find out in what condition the undercut type is. It turned out that he was completely paralyzed except for his mouth. After a while, Earl was led into an office. Paralyzed Buck signed an explanatory note where he told about his conflict with Ron. Buck's blood was also found on Earl's shoes. Baldy didn't say anything in response to this and just went back alone. Soon someone finished Buck off by blowing solvent through his veins. The authoritat is going to be transferred to another prison, and he was supposed to get out early, as well as his young friend, but he is not so smooth, because he got in touch with the gang, and the judge, having familiarized himself with the reports of the prison staff, concluded that Ron is a dangerous man who cannot be returned back to society. He will continue to serve his 5-year sentence. At the same time Earl put on a show. He cut himself and got blood all over himself. He also soaked his cereal in coffee to make it look like feces. He soaked it on the toilet and ate it in front of the guard. His father promises Ron to sell the house and hire the best lawyer, but the guy doesn't care anymore. In prison, he became a completely different person. The only thing that aroused emotions was a meeting with his best friend, and he regrets only that he did not cut Baku's throat. With his prank, The authorities realized that he was not transferred to another prison. There was no psychologist there. He and Ron have at least another year in solitary, so why don't they escape? But they need help from the outside, and Ron is relying on his father. The head of security is an old acquaintance of Earl's, so he is soon released from solitary. Ron can't wait to escape, but first he has to think of a plan. No one has escaped from here for a couple years. The guards have relaxed. The guy has already had a talk with his father. In Costa Rica, he has an acquaintance who will be able to shelter the fugitives. As the friends were discussing their escape plan in the shower, another prisoner was humming a song loudly. Earl demanded that he shut up, and the fool suddenly jumped on them and cut the conspirators with a toothbrush. That's how the two of them ended up in the infirmary. The main thing now is that they don't get punished and get screwed over again on their own. Because of racism, supposedly they fought with that man over skin color. Ron's asleep. Earl looks at him like he's his son. Suddenly, the authority figure is summoned by Richland. He apologizes for his black brother. The type is just a crazy weirdo. It wasn't intentional. Richland hopes Earl won't retaliate. But the white brothers were already planning a showdown because Earl is a big shot, but the authorities asked him to keep it quiet and not to start a war. But something had already happened to that fool, and judging by the fact that the Iron Man went alone next, the blacks decided to deal with him themselves. That man's body, with stab wounds, was found in a dumpster. When Earl went out to the yard, he noticed a garbage truck pulling out of the prison grounds. The gears in his head whirled. Yeah, one had tried to escape like that before and died. But his body was found 10 miles away. The key is to survive. They'll hide in the rear compartment and block the presses with spacers. The authority figure tells his buddies about his plan, and they have to warn the guys in the truck about the escape. Paul doubts his old friend will find a place on the outside. The day of the escape has arrived. Everything is already planned. From the line in the dining room, the conspirators sneak into the kitchen, but the spacers were not there. Earl, however, was not nervous for nothing. They were hidden a little farther away. The fugitives got to the garbage truck. Ron jumped into it first. They covered him with bags, but suddenly a guard came and Earl didn't have time to hide in the garbage truck. He tensely watched to see if his friend could block the press, and he managed to do so. The guards inspected the truck and gave the okay to move on. Well, Earl went home. Better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. The recidivist concluded and mingled with the crowd of convicts.